So I first want to acknowledge that Dalhousie is located on the Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people, and we encourage you to take some time to think about the importance of engaging in land acknowledgements and reflecting on how you bring equity, diversity, and inclusivity into your own teaching. So I just want to introduce our 4 panelists today who have been so lovely to offer their time during this busy semester. So we first have Dr. Joseph Tassone, who is a postdoctoral fellow in chemistry from Yale University and is also working at Dalhousie and is actually coming back to his roots in Dalhousie where he completed his PhD. We have Rebecca Tucker, a PhD student in clinical psychology here at Dalhousie University. We also have Robin Moore, who works as an educational developer with students here at the Center for Learning and Teaching. And we have Dr. David Pillion, the Director of Counselling and Psychological Services at Dalhousie University. So today's session is going to be a little bit deconstructed. We want it to be informal and engaging, and we want everyone to feel the opportunity to participate and share their own experiences. So we're going to first start off with Joseph and Rebecca sharing their own insights and experiences with receiving feedback on their teaching, both understanding how to sift through the feedback that is really relevant and also how to deal with feedback that might be outside of your own control. We'll then open the session for your questions and comments, so feel free to either ask those in the chat while people are presenting or to ask them during the question period as well. And like I said, if you want to use your microphone, please feel free to do so. Just raise your hand and we'll call on you to speak. We'll then move on to the discussion of how to use feedback to enhance your teaching, and then end with some strategies on how to cope with negative feedback. Before I hand it over to the presenters, I do want to do just a quick icebreaker activity. So I want you to reflect and think about 3 words that come to mind when you think about your teaching this fall. I'd like you to answer with each word as its own entry. And if you go to www.menti.com, I'll put that into the chat right now. You'll be taken to a website where you'll want to enter the numeric code there, and you'll have an opportunity to answer this question and put in each word as its own entry. So we'll give you a couple minutes to head to that link in the chat, enter that code, and begin thinking about that question. And while we do that, I'm just going to share my screen and show you the words that come up. And if you have any difficulties accessing that link or connecting to the Menti poll, please feel free to let us know in chat. And we'll take some time to get you to reflect upon that and see what people say. Oh, Patricia, you were only able to enter 1? Oh, I'm really sorry. It is set up so that you should be able to enter a few. Yep, if you hit enter, you should be able to enter another one. If not, maybe go back to the link and try again. Or if you can't access it, feel free to put your responses in the text here as well. So we have some great words coming through. So challenging, intense, impersonal, busy, unknown. Technology is a big one that came up. I think that's a huge learning curve that we're all experiencing right now. Overwhelming, exhausting. It's wonderful to see fun in there. I think different could be also a positive aspect of the new landscape, but certainly there's a lot of words that express kind of the challenges and the difficulties that everyone is experiencing, both students and instructors and TAs, lab demonstrators, in kind of approaching this new landscape. So I'll have a couple more seconds for people to enter in. Are there any words that are resonating with people or might, really highlight your own experience with teaching, whether it's face-to-face or online? I think that disconnected and that lonely and isolating are really important words. And oftentimes we really try in our own teaching to kind of connect people, and it's so much easier to do in face-to-face and to get that feedback that in an online environment, it's really difficult to understand how students are interacting with ourselves and the teaching that we do. And just as we think that students are lonely and isolated, instructors and TAs and people who are, teaching in classes are just as lonely and isolated as well. So thank you so much for that. I'm just going to go back to our slides for now. And I want to introduce our next two panelists. So we're going to talk with Joseph and Rebecca, and they're going to have a few minutes to share their own reflections and experiences. We'll start with Joseph. I'm sorry, my dog's very excited to hear both Joseph and Rebecca speak. And then once they're finished sharing their experiences, we'll open it up to everybody to ask their own questions and share their own feedback. So Joseph, I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm going to stop the presentation.
Sounds good. Good morning, everyone. Thanks again to Jill and Robin for inviting me to speak today. I was just thinking about some of my experiences as a TA, and as Jill mentioned, I'm currently actually working back with first year chemistry, even though I graduated this past spring. And I was just thinking about how atypical the circumstances are for this term in particular, in terms of everything that's going on. So I think everyone's a little bit, the expectations are kind of disconnected from what are typically students and instructors are expecting for their courses, in terms of like first year students. Again, they're coming into something brand new that they're definitely not used to. And upper year students are largely, I imagine, used to in-person classes and everything that entails. So there's a disconnect there in terms of expectations, I think, which is leading to a lot of frustration potentially on the students, but also in terms of the instructors as well. And as TAs or lab, or in the lab or in lecture and tutorials and things like that, you're sort of the first line. So we often bear the brunt of that sort of frustration whenever it arises in these sort of instances. So it's important to think about it perhaps in that way, and well, it's important always to try not to take negative criticism personally, although that's still something with. But I think it's important in that context to understand where the students are coming from, and perhaps to show that vulnerability in your own frustrations to students when it comes up, so that they can understand the other side of things and maybe come to appreciate where you're coming from in terms of how you're trying to facilitate their learning in this new environment for everyone. And that's a good point, I guess, in terms of generally how I still try and deal with feedback that I receive, both positive and negative, is that I try and reflect upon, do I think the feedback is valid objectively? And it's, feedback is always offering a different perspective from what you intended to do in terms of a teaching activity or style. So you want to assess your abilities and your intentions honestly, and see if that feedback sort of can help improve what you were trying to do, or what you were trying to do. And I think it's always important to ask is like, are you doing the best to try and provide students, or all that you can to provide students with the best teaching experience possible? And we can always improve or move that goalpost forward, but I think it's important to keep the feedback in context to what you're actually trying to achieve. But I've spoken, I think, for a little while, so I'll pass it over to Rebecca to see if she has any other additional details to offer or insight to offer.
Thank you. And thanks for inviting me as well. I'm coming from a bit of a different perspective. I haven't taught in this online context as of yet. But in my degree at Dal, I've done lab instructor a couple times. I've taught a couple courses. I've kind of moved through that spectrum as I went. And in each case, what I find about ratings of instruction is that it's such an interesting context to get such direct feedback, and so much of it, because often we don't get that in interaction. So it's like I remember feeling overwhelmed my first large class, and I got this 8-page PDF document of just lists of comments, and it's a lot to look at. It's a lot. For me, I'll go off that experience. I certainly allowed myself to skim it once and then put it away for a little bit so that I could get rid of that knee-jerk reaction of like that personal context to it or how I felt about it rather than what it was actually saying. And then when I went back to it, I tried to separate what I called actionable, like what could I actually change? And I think that's what I'm hearing is coming up even now is like, we're getting feedback on things that I don't actually have control over. And even in normal semesters, that happens. I had feedback about whether or not the course should have a TA, which is not in my control, or whether or not a course content was interesting, which is not in my control. You can do the best you can. So just trying to figure out what you actually can do and what you can't is so essential. And trying to take as much as you can of that sting out of some of it that's bound to come up. And then I also think that, and I had just started thinking about this again recently, kind of that informal feedback piece. I wish looking back I had integrated it even more a little bit, like not at the end of a semester when you get all these things about you wish you could have changed. So I had one instance where in a class I just directly asked like what's going well, what's going not, what I could change. Only one student was brave enough to actually answer me, which was really appreciated, and I could actually make some changes. So I think that's an important process if we can figure out how to do that. Maybe not asking in person would have been a better choice because it's nerve-wracking for students. And I guess the last thing with my time is I think you touched on something really important is trying to think about the student's perspective. So there were a couple times where there were personal comments about interactions that I try to step back and think like, what might they be going through at that time, or what might they have wanted from the interaction that I wasn't able to give them? Not because I'm bad at my job or but like what might they be thinking? I remember being an undergrad, it's stressful, it's hard, you're looking for marks, you're looking for feedback, you want to do better, it's overwhelming, and like that's important to remember is like, what might they be bringing to an interaction that I might not know about? And how can I do my best to listen and give them what I can within my power, even with that, if it feels personal. So I think some of that's important to think about. But it's hard. I'm going to be honest, like I struggle to get used to it too. It's not something we learn how to do. It's not something that's explicitly taught. Like it's hard. But even things like this is important. Like I wish I had had something like this earlier or talking to other TAs or talking to other people, reaching out. I think that's essential. And I think that's like, I'm happy to answer more questions or share more, but that's what's on the top of my head right now.
Thank you, Rebecca and Joseph. I want to echo the how hard it is to receive feedback just in general sense, but sometimes when we're teaching, we even have to be more vulnerable, not only just to model receiving feedback for our students, but also being open to receiving it and then pivoting and being brave enough to come back to the classroom, whether it's face-to-face or virtual online, and accepting that feedback and potentially pivoting. But Rebecca and Joseph, you both mentioned something really interesting. It's understanding what feedback is really useful and objective, things that you can change. As a TA, marker, lab demonstrator, you're in a unique position, unlike instructors, where a lot of times you don't have the autonomy to actually make those changes, to really enact that feedback that might be needed at a larger level to change the student experience. So I'm wondering, and this is for all panelists, how you might help individuals kind of both identify, what is the feedback that's the most useful, that is actually reasonable to change for a TA, marker, lab demonstrator who might not have the autonomy to make those really large, broad course changes. And then how do you deal with feedback when things are not working for students, but it's completely outside of your control. What are some strategies you use, and how do you keep getting back to the front of the classroom or the front of the Zoom room or Collaborate room to continue to teach and provide students with a good learning environment? I know that's a hefty question. Joseph, I think you might include it.
Well, I had thought about again, perhaps it's not something you can necessarily control. We have a little bit more control over, but informally, if you're hearing from students the same actionable piece of feedback like this, X isn't working from multiple students in different situations, perhaps it's a good idea to bring that to the attention of the instructor. Again, because you're right there, and oftentimes students will feel more comfortable talking to the TA. You've built up a little bit more of a rapport in the lab, for example. So if you're hearing a lot of feedback, perhaps you can bring that up to the instructor to see if you can enact that widespread change for the course. That they may not be hearing that feedback because they're not directly, well, they are involved with the students, but they aren't seeing it firsthand, perhaps necessarily.
I think we lost Rebecca for a moment, so I can just jump in. I think the kind of getting at your first question, Jill, of deciding whether or not it is actionable is thinking about how what the feedback they gave you and what you think that they want to come out of that and what the outcome would look like, and kind of work backwards from there. Like if they don't like how the test was way too much pressure, you might think, oh, well, they want more quizzes, and that's something that you can't really handle. But if they're just feeling overwhelmed about handling the content, maybe there's things that you can do as a TA that is supporting them in that way. We've lost Jill as well. Oh, she's back. Thinking about just like what you think their outcome that they would like, and then figuring out who would be best responsible for that is kind of my best attempt at answering your question.
That's great. I think we also might be experiencing my nightmare at the moment of technology completely failing in the middle of a session or a classroom. So thank you for everyone who are still here. I also want to bring in Patricia's comment, who mentions we could also inform IT if it's a technology related issue. And I just want to go back to that word cloud where technology was the primary word. And I think that the student experience is really impacted this semester by technology, that learning curve. And so also understanding whether or not that's your role. So are you responsible for troubleshooting all the technology, or is that something that you can perhaps direct students to somewhere else, so IT services, so that way that role isn't on your shoulders and that's not overwhelming you. It's also important to note that, well, just as in this case here, technology does fail, and oftentimes it's the instructor, the TAs, the demonstrators who get the brunt of that experience because they're the ones using it, they're the ones there in the moment. And sometimes it's hard not to take it personally, but it's important to remember yourself, but also to remind your students that this is completely outside of your control, and that you're sharing those same frustrations as your students have as well. So I do want to open up the chat if anyone does have questions. I think we are experiencing some technical difficulties with people coming back in and potentially dropping. So we can wait a second or two. I see Rebecca's back.
Hi, sorry. Kicked me off.
No. I think we had a bit of a blip in the Collaborate service. So we'll wait a few seconds for people to join back in. I'm sorry about that, everyone. Great learning moment about some of the experiences that you may have experienced as a instructor, TA, or demonstrator, where technology fails you. Even though you've come prepared, you're organized, there's things outside of your control that can always happen that impact the experience of the teaching that you're delivering. Excellent. So I want to also ask the panelists, there were several words that came out as isolating, um, lonely, disconnected, and I know we think about this a lot in the context of students, but perhaps you could share your own experiences um, as somebody who is teaching in a class, how you might navigate some of those. So are there any suggestions about kind of overcoming some of those feelings that you might be able to provide assistance with for some TAs and markers and demos that are feeling kind of lonely and isolated and not being able to connect with their students like you traditionally would in a face-to-face classroom?
I can jump in. I'll start with the preface that every course is going to be different, and the amount of interaction you have with your students is going to be very different based on the size and how many TAs and kind of what the instructor wants from you. But I think kind of building in your own teaching assistant or lab instructor presence can be really important. Letting the students know a bit about yourself, knowing how to contact you, the best ways to do that. Maybe you offer like a open time slot for drop-in hours, something like that. Just letting the students know that you're always there. And I think as a TA, we often have kind of a unique role that we're usually kind of more approachable than the instructor in a lot of ways. We might be closer in age to the students. We probably did our undergrads more recently, so we can relate to the students very well. And I think kind of letting yourself be open and approachable to the students will allow them to feel comfortable reaching out to you. And not all of them will. Not all of them will feel comfortable or want to get in contact with you, but being open. And if you have the time to reach out to students individually, if they're, they're struggling or they did really well and you just want to kind of build that rapport, if you send your feedback all out through Brightspace with no personalizing or anything, they might be less likely to contact you than if you send an email to each student who did really well. Again, depending on your class size, if you have 200 students, probably not very doable. But if it's a smaller group, and if you do have a big group, just letting them know the ways that they can contact you. I think that's, I know I've repeated myself, but I think it's really important because students might not know the best way to contact you, and that can be intimidating. So trying to be the friendly option if they're kind of feeling alone and struggling, that you might be their first and maybe best contact, and letting them know that.
I also think it's important to remember that your instructor is also a really great support service, not support service, but support there for you. So if you are feeling isolated, if you are feeling disconnected, especially from the content, the class, the teaching, and your students, reach out to your instructor and perhaps together you can talk with them to say, what are some ways that you can feel more integrated into the class, but also share some of your concerns, because I imagine that if you're receiving feedback that you might be feeling isolates you even more from the class, your instructor will also have received that feedback too, and perhaps you can work together to find a solution and come together to pivot or adapt to the moment in the course to help address some of those student concerns, but also to make you feel more connected as well. And I just want to highlight David's comment. Yes, it's always important to keep calm and carry on with those technology glitches. Sometimes it's the most difficult when the bottom kind of comes out from underneath you. But over time, it does get a little bit easier. And I think sharing with your students that you also are, worried about technology, that it's a bit of a discomfort for you, can oftentimes create an environment where students are maybe a bit more forgiving when you experience these bumps. So take them and talk about them and embrace them as just a unique experience in this landscape. Christine also mentions she tried writing this before Collaborate booted her. I find the most frustrating part is when a student or just someone giving feedback who writes or says something that really isn't something you can change, or is written and said as more of a personal attack as opposed to something constructive. I do think that this is probably a landscape where we might be receiving more of this, given that both students' tensions are quite high. People are already stressed out, they're burnt out, they're juggling a lot of new things. And I imagine, and David, you might be able to speak a little bit to this too, in terms of how people are feeling and how that makes them more responsive or perhaps quick to act or say something that might not actually reflect how they truly feel or their perceptions of the situation. So I imagine that we're all experiencing a lot more personal or curt responses from people. And it might be really important to remember that it could not have anything to do with their current experience in your class. It could be from a number of factors related to everything that's happening outside. But it doesn't make it that less uncomfortable to hear it and take it or to deal with it. So any strategies from our panelists, especially when it's a personal attack or personalized feedback that you can't change, how you might adapt to that in the moment or keep carrying on, as David so nicely put.
I think for me, I think the two parts there. One, like the things that you can't really change, whether that's structural or something about just the way you talk or the way, there's lots of different things that's hard to change. What I tried to do in the past is like try to figure out like what are they kind of trying to say with that. Like there's often, like I had one that was kind of personal, said some not nice things about the way I interacted. And I try to pull out like, what is it that maybe they didn't get from our interaction? Like if we can sidestep that personal just for a minute, and it's easier said than done, but like what is it that might have happened? What is it that they might be trying to say with that? And then that piece comes in, like you said, overwhelmed, stressed out, upset, that what's underneath that. And I think part of that is like it's tough. It's tough to take that personal piece out. But I try to remember that even outside of teaching, we don't all get along. Like that happens outside of teaching too. Interaction styles conflict. People say things in a way that isn't the nicest. Like that's not just your teaching. It's not just, it happens. So like what else, like what can we do about that? Sometimes we just have to remember that that happens. And I know that sounds simplistic, but I had to go through that thought process myself. Like, okay, that interaction didn't go well. What can I do to make sure that doesn't happen again on my side? What can I do? I don't, like, it's tough. It's tough when it's personal, across the board.
It is, and sometimes having a debriefing buddy or somebody that you can share can help put more context with. Joseph, I believe you were about to speak to, and I interrupted.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of, oftentimes I find too, is that it's only like one or two negative comments that seem to overshadow a lot of the positive feedback that people get. And so I think it's important, especially when it's like a small number or a small personal, what feels like a personal feedback, is to acknowledge all of the positive feedback that you received from perhaps some of the other students, and put that into, and weigh that and put that in context in how you know, like you mentioned, Rebecca, that you're never going to get along and you're never going to be able to please everyone. And so there's always going to be that chance of getting that negative feedback that you can't act on or that you can't change. And so I think putting it in the context of all the positive feedback and trying to just, if you're getting, you know, overwhelming positive feedback, to just keep on doing what you're doing. If the vast majority of students seem to appreciate and enjoy what you've been doing for them.
And I can tell you one like concrete thing I did when I had a big document of that stuff is I reflected on that the first time I read it. I thought about it. I tried to manage that as much as I can, the emotional piece, that reactive piece. And then I went through and I took the things that I saw as I've said before, actionable, or things you can do something about, or things that were more constructive, and I put them in a separate document. Because once I reflected on it and dealt with it, I didn't want to go back to that more personal side that I knew I couldn't do something about every time I wanted to look at the constructive stuff. Because then it was easier for me to look at it when I went to teach the next time, and I didn't have to rehash that every time. Because it's just not helpful to keep fixating on that. So that was like something I had to do to be okay and still use the feedback that was helpful.
And that's a really great strategy. I think you both comment on the fact that sometimes in the heat of the moment, when we're first receiving the feedback, we tend to focus on the highly negative, the highly emotional. pieces of feedback. So taking some time to digest the feedback, not reacting to it right away, maybe reading it first, putting it down, and coming back to it the next day with a really clear sense and a less reactive approach is important. But then Rebecca, your suggestion of separating, what Joseph had mentioned as the really objective, tangible pieces that you can not only fix, but maybe recurrent is important because even though feedback might be difficult to hear, it's also important to reflect upon and to react and consider. So having that ability to piece them or parse them apart is important. David.
Thank you. I'll talk to some of these when we get to my section near to the end. But one of the things I wanted to just put on the table is that I think it's important to remember that TAs, be they senior undergrads or graduate students or even postdocs, they're in a position with respect to their professional identity development that negative feedback, harsh feedback, or even inappropriate feedback are likely going to be felt much more deeply and keenly than they would otherwise for folks who have been supporting students, teaching students, instructing students for some time. And I do think it's relevant to appreciate, as I'm sure all TAs who are on the other end of receiving some harsh or challenging feedback sometimes are likely remembering that this is a unique time in your life and in your professional identity development. So to be getting comments and feedback like this, not surprisingly, would stick much more than the positive feedback. And I loved what Joseph said in terms of trying to weigh and balance it all out with all the other note of positive feedback one has received. But even still, it's likely hard to do that given the time of life, that professional life, that situations like this are arising.
Yes, Robin.
I just wanted to jump in. I feel like we're talking a little bit about the SRIs and kind of after the fact data, but I just want to kind of share with everyone that if you get an email from a student, it's okay to kind of stand your ground and say, politely, obviously remember the dynamic you've got there, but just say, I don't really appreciate the tone in which you've addressed me. As Patricia said, some of the comments can be really nasty and the students might just not know how to give feedback. And it's okay to set those boundaries and just say, I don't appreciate the tone in which you've taken with me. Is there something that in particular you'd like to discuss with me or something I can improve on? Without sounding too aggressive, I don't really want to be just kind of a dumping ground. There's probably a nicer way to say that, and I would encourage you to find that. But I think a lot of the time we are the first kind of response for just frustration, and it ends up on our plates. And obviously you want to handle it gracefully and politely, but it's okay to say, I don't appreciate the tone, the words you've used, and setting those boundaries to kind of protect yourself in that way, because it's not useful in any way. As Christine just put in the chat, I can appreciate your frustration at this time. Yes, definitely acknowledge their feelings and understand where they're coming from, but also, you don't have to put up with verbal abuse from your students. It's okay to be setting the rules. I treat you with respect, I expect the same back, and kind of building that relationship. As Patricia said, learning how to give feedback. Sometimes all they've had is just frustration and yelling, and they don't know how to do it respectfully and constructively. So I think that's important as well.
Those are really great points, David and Robin. And I might sound like a broken record, but I want to go back to the instructor as support. As a TA, yes, you might be the first frontline person to address student emails, but you shouldn't feel that it is solely your responsibility to take in and address all the feedback, negative or positive, from students. And if you are feeling overwhelmed, I think it's really important to let your instructor know what feedback you're receiving and talk about strategies for dealing with that or pathways for letting the instructor know what the student experience is. So don't feel that you're alone in having to deal with that feedback. Make sure that you always engage with the instructor to help support you with either shuffling through that feedback, understanding how you yourself can change potentially some of your teaching approaches, but also understanding, the current context in the classroom and what is some of that, objective feedback versus the personal contextual feedback that might be more the student experience beyond the course. So that's really helpful, and I would encourage you to definitely do that. So I want to move forward and introduce Robin. She's going to be sharing some information around how to use the feedback for teaching development. Please do continue to share your comments and questions in the chat. The panelists will still be able to respond, and certainly we will have likely a few minutes at the end of the session to address any questions that you have.
Great, thank you, Jill. So I've just got some slides mostly to keep me on track. And these slides I think will be shared with the recording as well. So if there's anything on there that you think is really helpful, hopefully we'll be able to get them to you. If you don't get them, you can always send Jill or I an email. So we've heard kind of practical approaches to dealing with the feedback, and I want to thank Joseph and Rebecca for sharing their experiences. I think it's always very helpful and kind of heartening to hear that other people have gone through what you might be going through right now. But I want to take a minute and talk about kind of in terms of your teaching development, what you can do with the feedback. So there's two main ways that you can use the feedback. So the first is in self-reflection, and the second is in self-promotion. I will focus more on the self-reflection piece today. Oh, there we go. So self-reflection is an ongoing and purposeful process. It's an evaluation of our behaviors, experiences, attitudes, and beliefs, and it really emphasizes the why and not the what of the situation. It's more about the factors around the situation rather than what happened exactly. And self-reflection can be used to identify how we can improve and enhance our teaching. And I think this is a really important piece, that you're getting all this feedback, but then how do you go ahead and use it to improve and hopefully not get that same negative feedback again in the future, if possible. So reflection is important because it gives you a bit of control over your teaching. You can think about what you did previously and how you might change it in the future, and how you might develop different skills or try out different approaches. And through this, it's a part of professional development, so that you should always be considering how you've been doing things and how you might improve and how you might grow as an educator. It also aids your own understanding of teaching and learning. And it's important to model for learners, because reflection is important at every stage of learning, whether you're a beginner in a field or you're very experienced. It's always important to reflect on what you've done previously and where to go from there. And I think modeling that for your students is very important. So I just want to take a moment and go through Gibbs' model of reflection. So first I'll just explain what the model of reflection is, and then I'll go through it again with a brief example. So the first thing is describing what happened. What is the event or object that you're reflecting on? You think about what your thoughts and feelings were at the time of that event or incident or whatever it was. You evaluate what was good and what was bad about the experience. And you analyze what you can make sense of out of the situation. And then to conclude, what else could you have done? Maybe you responded in one way, but there might be another way to respond. And finally, the action plan. If you were to find yourself in the situation again, would you go through the same way you did the first time, or would you consider some of those other concluding responses? So I know it went a little quick, but I want to go through a bit slower with an example. So say you got an email from a student and they're very displeased with the grade that they received on the most recent lab report. Think about what you were thinking and feeling when you got that email. Maybe you were a bit defensive because you thought that you graded fairly and you feel that they're kind of questioning your authority. Or maybe on the other end, you kind of questioned your marking. You're like, oh, well, maybe I was a little too harsh. I've gotten a couple of these emails. Thinking through what your thoughts and feelings were, acknowledging that they're all valid, whatever you were thinking and feeling at the time. But identifying those, and then evaluating what was good and bad about the experience. Maybe the email was bad, it was hurtful, it was not constructive, but maybe you were really pleased with how you responded to the email. You responded with grace, you set boundaries, you asked what were the actionable steps. I really like that term that Rebecca used, the actionable feedback. And then trying to make sense of the situation, understanding why the student responded in such an aggressive or kind of inappropriate way, understanding maybe their motivations behind the email, and then concluding of what else you could have done. Maybe you answered the email very appropriately, or maybe you didn't. Maybe you should have gone to the instructor or the teaching team if there's other TAs, and then considering your action plan. Would you do this? Would you answer the same way, or would you try one of these other conclusions that you considered? So I think this is just a really helpful way of thinking through how you might approach the feedback that you are receiving from your students. So just a bit more on the different steps. When you're describing it, kind of the what happened stage, what are the facts or background information that you have? Maybe you know that this is a particularly tricky lab topic that the students often struggle with. And what do you know about the situation? Maybe you know the student has their sights set on medical school, so getting a bad grade is very distressing for them. They're worried about their future. Thinking about who's involved, is it just you and the student? Is it you and the instructor or the TA team? Is it a lab group? And what did you learn from that situation? Is there things that you can take away and improve on next time? And then thinking about analyzing or interpreting it from different perspectives. So what are your thoughts, feelings, and perceptions about the problem or the situation? How did you think? How did you feel? And how did you perceive the email when you got it? And what are your beliefs about the nature of your knowledge? So it's a little more broad because the epistemic perspective. So you might be very confident in your grading, but think about why you know that. Is it because you knew the rubric really well? You know the topic really well? You understand where the grades come from, and you can give them a breakdown of each mark that they lost. Knowing kind of where your beliefs and feelings come from can make you more confident in those thoughts and feelings. But then also consider what the student might have been thinking or feeling. And obviously you're going to be a bit interpretive here. You probably don't know what was going on in their mind, but you can speculate. You can think, it's midterm season, they're an upper year student, it's a stressful time. And just having all of these different perspectives as you're reflecting. And lastly, thinking about the outcome and what you gained as a learner in the situation. So were you effective at solving the problem? How effective? Are there other ways to do it more effectively? What was the most meaningful thing to do here? Are you building a good relationship with the student, or did you kind of dismiss them and say, oh, no, my grading is correct, no questions? Probably not how you responded, but maybe if it was a stressful day and that's all you had time for, you might think that maybe it wasn't the most meaningful way to respond. And then what did you learn from the experience? Maybe you learned how to diffuse some tension between you and a student. Maybe you learned that you need to provide more comments attached to your grade, or else students get confused. And then what you learned from this might be what you can do differently, or it might be that you did a really good job and you're very proud of how you handled it and you'd like to do that again in the future. But if you do need to improve, what are the skills you might need to do that? What are the practices you may need to implement as well? So that's a bit on the self-reflection, and I'm happy to get to some questions about that at the end. I just want to make sure I don't go over my time and get into David's time. But the self-promotion piece is thinking about your career. So if you're thinking about a career in academia or in teaching in some way, you may want to incorporate some of the feedback you're getting into a teaching dossier. A teaching dossier provides an overview of your teaching for future employers. So it's your experience in teaching, maybe that's as a TA or an instructor or a lab demonstrator, your ideas about teaching, which are often encapsulated in the teaching philosophy, your practices in teaching, some of the things that you bring into the classroom that you use in your teaching, and of course, evidence of your teaching effectiveness, which is where the feedback piece really comes in. The teaching dossier is a formal document for your teaching, much like a CV is for your work or research experience. And using the feedback, often it's in the form of SRIs because they come in a neat little package. The quantitative data is all there. But you can also use things like emails or notes from students. It's best practice to ask permission and usually anonymize those as well. But then you might be considering, we've talked a lot about negative feedback, like how do you put that into a teaching dossier? And obviously if you're getting a nasty email from a student that has no actionable pieces, you probably won't include that in your teaching dossier because good would come from that. But maybe your SRIs aren't as high as you hope they would be, or maybe there's a particular one that's lower. Reflecting on how you'll use that feedback. And that's a really important piece in the dossier, is considering your reflection and how you're going to improve it later. So thinking about the steps that you'll take to hopefully improve that score in the future, showing this is a much better way of addressing the negative context or feedback is much better than trying to sweep it under the rug and hide it from employers. It shows that you have considered it and you're actively working towards it. And that's my little piece. Just have one little plug if you are interested in developing a teaching dossier, that we have an event coming up shortly. There's more information on our website, but it's November 23rd to December 4th. It's 2 weeks, some synchronous, a lot of asynchronous. And if you want more information, you can visit our website. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Robin. And please know that we are taking questions and answering them in the chat. Please feel free to share that your responses there. And now I'm going to hand it over to David, who has some really great suggestions around coping with the feedback. David, the floor is yours, David.
The screen is mine, I guess we would say, in these ages. So I'm very happy to be a part of the panel today, and particularly I found myself thinking about, in preparation for this session, what was asked of me in terms of some of the harsh feedback that is coming to our TAs and our lab instructors and so on these days. And just to reflect on that a little bit, I think it's always important to be mindful of the context we are in. When things are happening that are uncomfortable or things are changing in some way in terms of how people are responding. And certainly from the perspective of student health and wellness, we know from our clients that this is a particularly stressful time for students. And there certainly is something not only about the online learning environment, but the fact that for many people, they are living at home with their families or not here in the community in the way that they expect it to be. And then when it comes to online teaching, we're hearing directly on a day-to-day basis that students are much more stressed than they typically are. They're finding that things take longer to do, in part because they're viewing recordings of lectures and maybe having to go back over them and to try to make sure that they're understanding things. I don't know if this is a robust finding, but we're hearing a lot of feedback that there seems to be more assignments, more evaluative opportunities in each of the courses that students are having, which is contributing to their stress. Many times people are feeling the sense of they're missing out on something during this era of COVID. We all are mourning some of the losses of our normal day-to-day activities. And students, particularly early year students, are keenly feeling that. And certainly when you think about it, TAs may find themselves in the first line of engagement with students because there may be less interaction with professors. So if there is some harsh feedback or an increased frequency of that these days, I would suspect it has something to do with simply the stressfulness of being in this online world and, living through the pandemic as we are. Going back to the Menti poll at the beginning of the session, some of those words in terms of disconnected and I was jotting them down, isolated and distant and impersonal that folks are experiencing. Not only are the students who you are supporting as TAs experiencing that, but you're likely experiencing a lot of that as well. And so being mindful of where some of this feedback might be coming from, when people are additionally stressed, that leads to a number of other sorts of things. So people have a decreased sense of what we call frustration tolerance. They just can't manage and deal with some of their frustrations as easily as they can. As a result of that, their sort of judgment about what's appropriate to say and do might be a little different than normal. And people may find themselves saying things, doing things that perhaps just aren't best if they were to step back and reflect on that. And there's another phenomenon that exists right now called online disinhibition. And essentially what that is that we find ourselves likely saying and doing things in an online environment that we might not necessarily say in a face-to-face context. We hear examples of that a lot when it comes to things like cyberbullying and things that happen on social media. goodness, we even have elected officials who are tweeting things that I would hope and trust that they would not choose to say necessarily in person. So if there is a greater frequency of harsh, critical, inappropriate comments and feedback, it may be coming by virtue of some of these sorts of realities right now. When it comes to what to do about it, well, as per the last slide, it's important to remember where it's coming from. Constructive feedback is one thing, and as the various panelists have identified, those are great opportunities to grow and to learn and to reflect and to promote oneself. But when it's not constructive, when it truly is critical and hurtful, that's when we need to be really careful about what we do with that. And it's certainly important not to personalize that feedback. You know, the earlier comment about weighing the balance of the positive and the negative feedback and making sure that the positive sticks just as well as the negative is certainly important. But I would suggest it's relevant to be mindful of the context in which the students who are giving feedback are coming from, even when that feedback is not necessarily very kind at times. One can be empathic in terms of something like, I understand that things are stressful right now. I'm trying to help you with your coursework and your learning. So I'd ask you to, hold back on or refrain from saying hurtful comments like that. That's a nice and gracious way to make clear to someone that we actually see that they may be struggling with something, but they're actually saying and doing something that's not necessarily okay. And it is certainly fine to say ouch sometimes. If someone says something to us that hurts or stings a little bit, or we didn't see it coming, or it doesn't feel very good, just saying ouch, which, we might say when we, experience some, physical hurt. But when we say it in an interpersonal context, it actually stops the other person perhaps a little bit to reflect on what did they just do or say that perhaps contributed to that reaction. And certainly when some of the feedback is harsh and critical and even nasty, it is important to remember what is appropriate behavior and, the limits of that and what we need to do to enforce the appropriate guidelines and discourse in any of the course and instructional contexts that we're in. I didn't include it here, but other people have mentioned frequently the importance of seeking support from the course instructor, from other TAs, from a debriefing buddy, from your supervisor even, or any of your mentors. Those are important things to do. And I'll take a few moments to talk about in this context where even for TAs, as for the rest of us, things are so different that, when things are different, we have to adjust to that. And that's when we feel a little bit stressed by things. That's when things just take a little bit more of its toll. Therefore, it's really important to take good care of ourselves, at times like this. And, some of these things I trust are all doing, but just as a brief reminder, when it comes to taking good care of ourselves in the context of whatever might be stressful in our work, we all need a little bit of physical activity each day just because that's healthy for the mind and the body. We need to make sure we are well hydrated because that makes everything work well, including getting enough sleep makes everything work well. Getting some, fun and pleasure every day in our lives, balances out, the challenges of work and the toils that we have to do. When we're stressed, it's important to make sure we try to avoid negative strategies to deal with that in terms of some substance use, alcohol, things like that. It's really important to stay connected with people that we care about and who care about us, even if in these days it is mostly virtual connections. It's so important in this era of working from home for so many of us that we know when we are turning things off for the day. And if that means changing your clothes and getting out of work clothes as a signal to yourself that you are now sort of into your private time, or any other strategies that you use, that's really important. Taking good care of ourselves means being very careful about what happens with our thinking and embracing healthy thoughts remembering that positive feedback when there might be a stinging or critical comment that comes in, trying to keep things in that broader perspective. Keeping your focus on one thing at a time. We can all only do so much, and if we do the best we can in the time we have with the things that are right in front of us, then we get to, at the end of the day, feel better about that and sort of close our eyes in a way that hopefully sends us off to a more comfortable sleep. And there's hope around every corner, even when we're stressed and feeling overwhelmed and fatigued and exhausted by things. Tomorrow can always be a better day. And sometimes, even though we're experiencing, challenges and difficulties right now, we have to remember what our purpose is and keep moving forward with our goals. But sometimes taking good care of ourselves means accessing some services and supports that exist. All of our student health and wellness services are still available, albeit they are delivered in a virtual sort of way. Checking the Dalhousie website, we'll find everything there that you need. And just remembering for yourself, or even sometimes you may need to suggest for the students who you are a TA for, that counseling services are available on a day-to-day basis, Monday through Saturday, each week at the university. It's all virtual counseling. We make it really easy for people, and they're available on a same-day basis, which means that people can book online or call in to get an appointment that day. And of course, we have a variety of other resources as well that are available, including the Good to Talk counseling option, which is a telephone line which allows people to call that number or to text that number 24 hours a day, 365 days a week, to address anything that someone might be struggling with or stressed by. And counselors are there at the other end of the line to support folks. We have a couple of other online counseling and mental health services there as well, but I won't go into detail about that. So bottom line is that things can be stressful. These things are happening more likely these days for all the reasons that we suspect. It's important to keep your perspective on what that means when that feedback is coming in. And if it truly is not constructive or helpful feedback, we need to be careful about how we respond to it and what we do to take care of ourselves to endure times like this. So perhaps we'll leave that at that point, Jill.
Thank you so much, David. And I want to thank everyone for coming today and our wonderful panelists for providing an hour of their day during this really busy term to share their insights and some advice. Thank you everyone for attending, and I do hope that you get to enjoy the rest of reading week and to take some of David's suggestions to take a break and take care of yourself, because it is a hard time for all of us right now. Thank you again.